on the wait list. If you're not, then make sure to email us so that you can bring that to our attention. So another thing is we're gonna, like before every class, we're gonna upload the slides so that you can view them by yourself, since we know that the projector, the presentation here is pretty small, and some of you in the back might not be able to see it, so you can follow along on the computers by yourself. Okay, so we're gonna get started with the topic of today, and it's HTML. So what is HTML? HTML is an acronym that stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And what it is, so we'll break it down. Hypertext, what that means is text displayed on the computer so that it references other documents. So just think about a document that links to another document and so on and so forth. That's what hypertext means. And what markup language means, as Amber sort of discussed last week, is just a sort of syntax to tell what kind of text belongs to what category of interpretation. So what HTML allows you to do is it allows you to interpret text in a specific way so that your browser understands like what a table is, what should be bold, what should be italicized, and those types of things. One important thing to remember is that because HTML is a markup language, it is not a programming language. So you can't write some really cool algorithm like do Google's like search algorithm by using strictly HTML. And HTML files are just really simple text files, and they just have an extension with .html. So there's nothing overly special about them at all. And HTML is developed by this organization called the World Wide Web Consortium. They have a website called wc3.org, and they're also the organization that helps to sort of develop newer technologies like HTML5 and help create standards so that web browser developers like Safari, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Chrome can sort of be able to agree upon a set standard and interpret documents in the same way. All right. So this is a slide that Amber went over last week. It shows what HTML can do for us. She explained about how we have this huge blob of text here that's really hard to read and really hard to understand. And I mean, if you were to see this on a web page, you'd just click out and you wouldn't even bother reading it. So with HTML, what we're able to do is sort of format this text in a more presentable way and something that's more readable to you. So in this case, we have an About Us section and some clearly defined pieces of this article, like what this company does and specific products that they make. So as an overview, the way HTML fits in is that HTML is a client-side technology and it's interpreted by a browser. And over the course, we're going to be learning each of these 5 elements of the internet. So like today, we're starting out with HTML, and then next week we're going to move on to CSS, do that for a couple of weeks. And then after CSS, we're going to be jumping into JavaScript, which I denoted by JS. And after we're done with the client-side technologies, we're going to move on to some server-side technologies, such as PHP and MySQL. So HTML by itself is kind of interesting because it doesn't, although it gives structure to a document, it doesn't necessarily make things look nice. So if you take, for example, a YouTube page, what you see here isn't just strictly HTML. It's actually a mixture of HTML, CSS, of course you have Flash here, and also some JavaScript. So the main thing to take away is that HTML is a language that helps you sort of define the markup of what the text should look like and give structure to it. So I'm going to give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. So here we have a Facebook. Oops. Okay, so here we have a Facebook page, and I'm going to do some really interesting things like I'm going to kill all the CSS and JavaScript. So what you see here is strictly HTML when you load up your Facebook homepage. That's all you get. It's really boring and ugly, and you wouldn't ever want to look at it. But what it does is it allows you to give structure to things so that later on you can use CSS to modify certain attributes. And with CSS, you have really nice looking interfaces like this. Okay. So now we're going to talk about more of the syntax of HTML. So HTML is comprised of what we call tags, and they allow us to sort of separate and distinguish what is actually the text you want to show to a user and what text is used to mark up that text that you want to show the user. So to break it down, basically with the HTML tag, you start with an opening brace, a less than error or less than sign, and the name of the tag. In this case, it's an image tag, and a closing brace that has a greater than tag. Okay, so here's a sort of more general description of what an HTML element is. Earlier I described an HTML tag, which you would see here, which is enclosed by the less than and greater than sign. Here we have a HTML element called the span. You'll learn more about what that is in a bit. And we have something called an attribute. And attributes are really interesting in that they always work in this sort of name-value pair. So in this case, we have an attribute called the class, and you put an equal sign, and then to specify the class, you would put a value in quotations. In this case, we call the class of this HTML element a caption. And so here we close the tag, and we have contents within the tag. And after we're finished typing up the contents of that tag, we would have to close it with basically a less than, something pretty much the same as the beginning tag, but with a slash, a forward slash, and without any attributes. So here's some general HTML attributes that apply to every single element that HTML provides. So earlier I'd given you an example about how span has a class. And what a class really is it's a way to sort of group elements together. So for example, let's just say you have like a certain, you have an image gallery, and you have 100 pictures on the HTML page, and you only want certain pictures to be formatted in a certain way. So in order to group those pictures that you want formatted in a certain way, you would have to assign it a class so that every element with that class name will be formatted in the specific way you want. There's also something called an ID, which is a unique identifier. It specifies a single element and only a single element. And that allows you to do things, to be more specific in specifying the HTML tag. So, and of course, the important thing is that no two elements can have the same identifier. So here I just have an example of how this is used. I put an image HTML element, and it has a class called myGrouping and an ID called myUniqueID. And it also has an extra attribute, which is part of the image class. But you don't have to worry about that for now. So HTML document structure, what you see here is the very essentials of what an HTML document is without any content. So I'm going to be breaking this down in a little bit, but we have something called a doc type up here, and you have an HTML tag, which specifies that this document is an HTML document. And then you have a head, which contains a lot of information, like something called metadata, and a title for the web page, and stuff to import like JavaScript, cascading style sheets, CSS. And within the body, this is sort of where the meat of your web page goes. This is where you'll be writing like the structure and basically the body of the page. All right, so doc type, what it basically does is it tells the browser what kind of standard you want to have the document interpreted by. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have heard about HTML5, and that's a specific type of standard. It's currently not completely specified yet. The W3C is still working on sort of getting the details worked out and finding a common agreement about how certain things should be implemented. But for right now, we're not going to be touching HTML5. We're going to be going into sort of the current version or older version, however you may want to think about it. And so this is what this tag allows you to specify that version of HTML. And we also have the HTML element, which sort of defines some other stuff. You won't have to worry about the doc type or the HTML element too much. We're going to be giving you sort of a skeleton of how documents should look like, and for the most part, you can just copy and paste it and not even have to worry about understanding what this means. But I'm just going to go over it for those who may be interested. So this is an overview of just some HTML stuff we're going to talk about today. And forgot to warn you guys, this is actually, honestly, like pretty boring stuff, like strictly HTML. I don't know what to say. It's honestly kind of...
I have a question about the doc types. Does every browser version support like every version of HTML? Probably not, right? Because some browsers came out like before HTML5 was ever.
Right, of course. Like yeah, like HTML5 will not work on Internet Explorer 6 or 7. Is Netscape still updated? I don't know.
Who's used Netscape before?
Yeah, so
Old school.
if you try to render stuff with Netscape nowadays, it probably won't work for most major websites. I even believe that Google has recently stopped supporting Internet Explorer 6 due to some security errors, security issues. So yeah, more about the head element. So earlier I'd shown you that the head contains like sort of several things which relate to the document but are not shown to the user directly. So what you can put in the head element is something called metadata. And what metadata does is it tells you what the document is about. For example, if you wrote a web page about wine from the 17th century or something, you would probably want to put some meta tags and describe the HTML document with specific keywords related to 17th century wine. And what that helps you to do is it helps search engines sort of parse your web page better. And so if someone were to Google 17th century wine, your web page would be able to show up higher on the results because you tagged the web page with metadata. There's also the title element, which is sort of the wording that goes on top of the window. So like in this case, if this were an HTML browser, your title would go here. And there's also content type, which specifies some other things. And one other thing it does is the head element also allows you to specify JavaScript documents that you want to import and cascading style sheets that you want to import. Yeah.
Is the meta inside the content type the same as the metadata of the head? Like, is there a relation between them?
Yeah, actually, that's what I was talking about. These two are the same, actually. So in this case, this is sort of a meta tag that you will have in your skeleton code, and it just specifies what the content type is. It's just an HTML document with that. So yeah, you don't have to worry about this too much, like I said. You'll be provided skeleton code to go off. Body tag, there's not much to discuss here. That's just basically where all your content goes. It typically doesn't contain a class or a ID because the body is supposed to be a unique element to the web page. So now we're going to talk about what we call H1 headings. So there's several different kinds of headers. They all range from H1 all the way up to H6. And what they specify is text that's sort of different in size. In this case, we have an H1 text that we've specified with HTML tags, and it says this is an H1 text. And H1s are on the large end of the scale. So if you were to render this, you would see this size of the text. And then if you had an H4 text, you would see a smaller size here. And that's sort of useful in allowing you to create a unified structure in your document instead of having to explicitly specify certain sizes for a document. You can just like say H1H. You can specify certain sections and like subsections with the H1 to H6 elements. Does that make sense? Yes.
Wait, what if you want something like bigger than?
Sorry, please speak up.
What if you want something bigger than H1?
If you want something bigger than H1, you can specify that by just specifying the font size.
That's what CSS.
Right.
So HTML is basically like telling the browser what types of elements these are, and then you go ahead and use CSS to style everything to what you want it to look like.
Right. So one thing is that without CSS, the browser interprets things in a certain font size, and later on, when you start learning about CSS, you can sort of specify, oh, I want all H1 headers to be a certain size, and all H2 to be another size. So you can specify sort of all of those types of headers in one pass. Okay, here's a really famous HTML element you should know about. It's the break element, and it's just BR, and that just adds spacing to the document, like a new line or a line feed. And it doesn't take any attributes. And one thing I want to mention though is that when you start learning CSS, to make sure that whenever you're positioning things, to not like use break tags to take up huge empty spaces. Instead, you're going to be able to you need to be able to use CSS to sort of position things and space things properly without having to arbitrarily add break tags to the document.
It's generally considered like kind of like bad practice to use these break lines to specify like when you want things to be on different lines. You can make different elements like, well, he'll go over span and div tags, but there's a difference between having things inline and having things blocked, which means they stack. So it's usually considered like, you shouldn't use these in your website. It's bad practice to use break tags just for like formatting purposes.
Right. There's only like really specific cases in which you should use it, like you need to, within a paragraph, just go to a new line, or you want just one space in between two paragraphs or something like that. So that's just an example of what break does. If you have one break, it'll just put the next text in the next line. If you have two, it'll add an extra space there. And if you have three, it'll add another space. All right, so I'm going to sort of go over URLs again, just to make sure you guys have this down. Because we're going to be talking about images in a couple of slides. So I'm going to break down a URL, and here we have http berkeley.edu/images. This is basically the Berkeley logo. So we start off here with the protocol, and that's HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And there are other types of protocols such as HTTPS, which you use when you sort of log into your CalNet ID or CalNet login to check your Berkeley email, or you go to an online banking site or some kind of secure site. Even Facebook has HTTPS that allows you to log into the content securely. There's also another protocol called FTP, and you're going to be using that later in the class to upload your files. So we start off here with the prefix, and that's www. Prefixes don't necessarily have to be www. So you can have other things like mail.berkeley.edu, right? And that would direct you to your Berkeley email. And so the domain here is specified by sort of the last two elements in this section before the slash. So in this case, the domain is berkeley.edu, and when you go to sites like flickr.com, it would be http://www.flickr.com, and the domain for that site is just flickr.com. Here we also have a path that specifies sort of folders, like basically this says within some image folder on the server, you have a sections folder, and within the sections folder you have a Berkeley text GIF file. All right.
On the previous slide, with the prefix, so if the prefix can be anything, like why is it, like what's the point of having like almost every website on the web having www?
I guess it's some ways it's historical.
Yeah, I think it's some weird historical thing where
It's just that's how
Yeah.
everything started out with, like when the internet first came about.
Has there been the ability to make any prefix like from the start?
Yeah, you can make any prefix you want. You can have, so for example, on our old website we have like,
or even if you just go to web design decal, you'll see that it forwards to spring11.webdesigndecal.com.
yeah, and you can make it arbitrary. I mean, you can put arbitrarily number of prefixes before it, like mail.spring11.webdesigndecal.com. So it's just something specified for the server so that it knows where to go. All right. So here's sort of a new thing. It's called absolute and relative URLs. Earlier, the example I'd given you was what we call an absolute URL. And what an absolute URL does is it specifies the exact link in its entirety about where the resource is located. So in this case, this URL is www.dog.com/tricks/jump.php. That's the absolute URL. And the relative URL would just be everything without the domain. One thing about relative URLs is if, for example, you were in, you had a PHP document or even an HTML document in this folder called tricks. In order to reference the image jumping dog within your HTML file, all you would have to do with the relative URL is just specify this like /jumpingdog.jpg. So it's basically relative to the current location of the file that was loaded. Is everyone okay with that, or do you want me to re-explain that? Okay.
Is the slash necessary? Can you just say jumping.jpg?
No. Yeah, it's not necessary. Actually, maybe.
Wait, which slash?
Before this person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, it's kind
It's
of.
convention. Like because if you don't put a slash there, it's kind of ambiguous as to whether you're talking about the directory or the current directory, but it's just usually convention to put a slash there.
Okay.
It's also safer.
Really Unix in those slashes. If you have a beginning slash?
It's a dot slash.
Yeah.
No, in Unix. Where you select
Oh.
your flag.
You're right.
Yeah.
But this is what you are.
That actually fine. Just put the slash.
Yeah, you want to explain it? Okay. So,
I'm just thinking about like 6 years ago when I used to code and I didn't need a backslash, but things have probably changed since then.
no, something like that wouldn't change. Yeah, you wouldn't need a backslash if you're within the same folder.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I just should. That's the only difference.
Yeah. Actually, just try it out. Try both out.
Okay.
Whichever works is okay.
Okay.
So once again, relative URLs differ in absolute URLs in that you don't specify the entirety of the original URL, right? So in this case, we have the entire URL, which specifies the domain, the folder it's under, and the image name. So if, for example, you had an HTML document that was located in www.dog.com/tricks/dogtricks.html, and you wanted to, within that HTML document, reference this picture, then instead of having to directly use this entire URL, you can specify what we call a relative URL by just saying the image is located at jumpingdog.jpg. And it'll know that because it's in the same folder, that the image must also be located in the same folder. And the reason why you want to do something like relative URL, one reason why you might want to do relative URLs is because it sort of makes things just related to each other. So for example, if you were to move your site over to www.dog1.com, you wouldn't have to re-specify these URLs for the images anymore, because they would all be relative to the current location. Okay, so this is the anchor element, and what anchors do is they allow you to specify hyperlinks, and they take in two mandatory attributes, or not. One of them is mandatory, one of them is optional. So the two attributes are href, which is just specifying the URL. So in this case, yeah, and the other attribute is title, which is a tooltip. And what a tooltip is in this picture, this sort of box that shows up whenever you hover over a link is what they call a tooltip. So I mean that's usually implemented with programs on your desktop, but they've also implemented with web pages, so that you can sort of change this, like these titles, so that if you wanted to do something like have an anchor like click here and with the here as a link, you can specify the title as the complete URL, so that when a user puts their cursor over that here link, they can see exactly which URL they're being directed to. So it's just sort of a usability construct that helps make things a lot more compatible and user-friendly. All right, the next HTML element is image, and it contains two attributes. One is the source, src, and that specifies where exactly the image is located. And you have an alt, which stands for alternate, and the alternate tells is sort of a backup in case the image doesn't get loaded. So sometimes web developers will move stuff around, and the image links might break, right? And in those cases, if the image link breaks, it can default on this alt by basically specifying what should have been there. And usually, I think for the most part that you might not need to use that, but it's just good practice to sort of add a description of what the image is supposed to be about.
It's also good for like accessibility. For example, if you have like people who are blind who are trying to look at your website and they're using like a screen reader or something, it'll be able to read the alt text and they can know like what the image is supposed to be about. So a lot of web design is trying to make things accessible to all audiences, whether it is like a computer that you're using to develop on, or like a mobile phone, or like maybe people with like disabilities who have to use special things to actually view your website.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about something, a formatting related issue. So earlier, Amber was mentioning something called block and inline, and what block and inline are sort of ways that specific kinds of HTML elements are formatted. So I haven't talked about this yet. I'll go into it a little bit, but P stands for paragraph, and paragraphs are what we call block line or block level elements. And block level elements have the special characteristic where if you were to put it in an HTML document and without any extra formatting, what would happen is the elements around it, instead of being on the same line, they would be pushed down to another line. So that's what block level element is. And we also have something called span. And what spans are their inline elements, sort of the more intuitive thing, in that everything that you specify that's an inline element will stay on that line, as long as it doesn't hit the side of the web page. So now we're going to talk about paragraph elements. They're generally pretty straightforward. If you have some paragraph text that you want to have sort of a block level formatting to, you would be placing it under in the paragraphs tab.